All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Hirschey. I'm a scientist, and today I'm going to be telling you about how to be a scientist, but then also a little bit about how to think about science. So I've actually asked my son, Henry, to introduce me. So it's common to have people introduce you. And so here's my son, Henry. He's 8 years old, and he's going to introduce me briefly.
Hi, my name is Henry. My dad is a scientist and professor at Duke, which is a university in North Carolina. He runs a lab that studies chemistry and biology, which are two different types of science. Today he was going to tell you about the different types of science and how to be a scientist.
Okay, thanks, Henry. So, when I was a kid, I liked science a lot, but I didn't know very much about it. I cut a lot of these caterpillars. I used to play in the woods a lot, and I also used to play a lot with Legos. And I kind of knew that there was something called science, but I didn't really know about the different types of sciences. So when I grew up, I learned that there's so many different types of sciences. We have ones that are chemistry and math and physics and biology. And some of you guys through this Farnham Street pop-up school, you guys have learned a little bit about biology or learned a little bit about physics or learned about these things. But so far, you haven't really been shown how to think about these in relationship to each other. So before I tell you about how to be a scientist and some of the things to think about when being a scientist, I want to tell you about how I think about how these are organized and the relationship between these different types of sciences. So in order to do that, so before we dive in, I want to then show you a quick video. So this quick video is actually one that I watched when I was a kid. I still remember it. It's a short video. I think it's pretty cool. It's called Powers of 10. And what it's going to do is it's going to describe different levels of looking at a single picture. And then I'm going to, after the video is done, I'm going to show you about how the different sciences relate to this video. So we'll just watch this. It's not quite 10 minutes long, but we can go ahead and just take a look.
Seen this.
The picnic near the lakeside in Chicago was the start of a lazy afternoon, early one October. We begin with a scene 1 meter wide, which we view from just 1 meter away. Now, every 10 seconds, we will look from 10 times farther away, and our field of view will be 10 times wider. This square is 10 meters wide, and in 10 seconds, the next square will be 10 times as wide. Our picture will center on the picnickers, even after they've been lost to sight. 100 meters wide. The distance a man can run in 10 seconds. Cars crowd the highway. Powerboats lie at their docks. The colorful bleachers are Soldiers Field. This square is 1 kilometer wide, 1,000 meters. The distance a racing car can travel in 10 seconds. We see the great city on the lake. 10 to the 4th meters, 10 kilometers. The distance a supersonic airplane can travel in 10 seconds. We see first the rounded end of Lake Michigan, then the whole Great Lake. 10 to the 5th meters. The distance an orbiting satellite covers in 10 seconds. Long parades of clouds, the day's weather in the Middle West. 10 to the 6th, a 1 with 6 zeros, 1 million meters. Soon the Earth will show as a solid sphere. We are able to see the whole Earth now, just over a minute along the journey. The Earth diminishes into the distance, but those background stars are so much farther away that they do not yet appear to move. A line extends at the true speed of light. In 1 second, it happens the tilted orbit of the moon.
So these are Obi-Wan Kenobi guys.
Now we mark a small part of the path in which the Earth moves about the sun. Now the orbital paths of the neighbor planets, Venus and Mars, then Mercury. Entering our field of view is the glowing center of our solar system, the sun. followed by the massive outer planets, swinging wide in their big orbits. That odd orbit belongs to Pluto. A fringe of a myriad comets too faint to see completes the solar system. Ten to the 14th. As the solar system shrinks to one bright point in the distance, our sun is plainly now only one among the stars. Looking back from here, we note 4 southern constellations, still much as they appear from the far side of the Earth.
And to the 16th.
This squares 10 to the 16th meters, 1 light year, not yet out to the next star. Our last 10-second step took us 10 light years further. The next will be 100. Our perspective changes so much in each step now that even the background stars will appear to converge. At last, we pass the bright star Arcturus and some stars of the Dipper. Normal but quite unfamiliar stars and clouds of gas surround us as we traverse the Milky Way galaxy. Giant steps carry us into the outskirts of the galaxy. And as we pull away, we begin to see the great flat spiral facing us. The time and path we chose to leave Chicago has brought us out of the galaxy along a course nearly perpendicular to its disk. The 2 little satellite galaxies of our own are the clouds of Magellan. 10 to the 22nd power, 1 million light years. Groups of galaxies bring a new level of structure to the scene. Glowing points are no longer single stars, but whole galaxies of stars seen as one. We pass the big Virgo cluster of galaxies among many others, 100 million light years out. As we approach the limit of our vision, we pause to start back home. This lonely scene, the galaxies like dust, is what most of space looks like. This emptiness is normal. The richness of our own neighborhood is the exception. The trip back to the picnic on the lakefront will be a sped-up version, reducing the distance to the Earth's surface by 1 power of 10 every 2 seconds. In each 2 seconds, we'll appear to cover 90% of the remaining distance back to Earth. Notice the alternation between great activity and relative inactivity, a rhythm that will continue all the way into our next goal, a proton in the nucleus of a carbon atom beneath the skin on the hand of the sleeping man at the picnic. Ten to the 9th meters, 10 to the 8th, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are back at our starting point. We slow up at 1 meter, 10 to the 0 power. Now we reduce the distance to our final destination by 90% every 10 seconds, each step much smaller than the one before. At 10 to the minus 2, 1/100th of a meter, 1 centimeter, we approach the surface of the hand. In a few seconds, we'll be entering the skin, crossing layer after layer from the outermost dead cells into a tiny blood vessel within. Skin layers vanish in turn. An outer layer of cells, felty collagen. The capillary, containing red blood cells and a roughly lymphocyte. We enter the white cell. Among its vital organelles, the porous wall of the cell nucleus appears. The nucleus within holds the heredity of the man in the coiled coils of DNA. As we close in, we come to the double helix itself, a molecule like a long twisted ladder whose rungs of paired bases spell out twice, in an alphabet of 4 letters, the words of the powerful genetic message. At the atomic scale, the interplay of form and motion becomes more visible. We focus on one commonplace group of 3 hydrogen atoms bonded by electrical forces to a carbon atom. 4 electrons make up the outer shell of the carbon itself. They appear in quantum motion as a swarm of shimmering points. At 10 to the minus 10 meters, 1 angstrom, we find ourselves right among those outer electrons. Now we come upon the two inner electrons held in a tighter swarm. As we draw toward the atom's attracting center, we enter upon a vast inner space. At last, the carbon nucleus. So massive and so small. This carbon nucleus is made up of 6 protons and 6 neutrons. We are in the domain of universal modules. There are protons and neutrons in every nucleus, electrons in every atom, atoms bonded into every molecule out to the farthest galaxy. As a single proton fills our scene, we reach the edge of present understanding. Are these some quarks in intense interaction? Our journey has taken us through 40 powers of 10. If now the field is 1 unit, then when we saw many clusters of galaxies together, it was 10 to the 40th, or 1 and 40 zeros.
All right, what did you guys think of that video?
Amazing.
Pretty wild journey, huh?
It was pretty well.
Yeah.
But that wasn't just from one camera.
No,
Pretty
no.
wild.
It's pretty wild that they made that video actually before I was even born. So, but I still remember it because I like how it shows all of these different levels. And so what I want to do over just like the next couple of minutes for you is take all of these different types of science and we can put them at different levels, and we can then reference, or we can talk about how the video that we just watched has different types of science built within it. And so if we study things at one level, it's called one type of science. And if we study things much bigger or much smaller, we just have different names for that. All right. So if we start out, remember the video started with this couple, they're having a picnic on a grassy lawn somewhere outside of Chicago. And all of the things that we would study in this picture, whether it's the person, whether it's the food, the plants, all of this we would call biology. That's one type of science. And it refers to studying things at this level. Now, if you remember, we went out first. So if we zoom out and we start studying planets or planetary motion or things in space, this is another type of science, and this is called astronomy. So everything in outer space and the things in outer space that we study has a different name. So it's all science. We would still study it. We just call it something slightly different. Now, we zoomed back in to this couple again, having a picnic, and then we started to zoom in a little bit closer. And when we start looking at the cells, so if you remember, we went through the skin and into the hand, and then we went to a blood vessel. And there's 2 different types of cells in the blood vessel. On the left-hand picture here, this like kind of roughly cell, this is a lymphocyte. This is actually a cell that helps keep us healthy, so it's really important. The red cell that's behind it is called a red blood cell. Not a very clever name, but easy to remember. And this is the cell that carries oxygen. So these are 2 different types of cells. And scientists who study these are oftentimes called molecular biologists, or sometimes even biochemists. The picture there on the right is what they also showed in the video, and this is DNA. And I watched one of your other lectures that you had that described DNA and how DNA goes from DNA to RNA into protein, if you guys remember that pop-up lecture that you had. So DNA would look something like this. It's a coiled coil. And if you study DNA, oftentimes, again, this is called molecular biology, or sometimes biochemistry. So if we zoom down a little bit closer, we can start to look at the components that DNA is made out of. Remember, we're zooming in here. And so inside of that DNA are molecules. And if you study the molecules, like this one is carbon, this is called chemistry. So chemistry is oftentimes referred to as the building blocks that make lots of different things, in this case, the DNA. But if you remember, we zoomed in even further, and we start to get to this level. And when we start talking about the atoms within molecules and how the atoms interact with each other, this is what we call physics. And so physics essentially describes the rules or the principles that these different atoms will then fit together in. And finally, if we zoom in even all the way at the end, if you remember in the video, they said, we are at the current limit of our understanding, meaning we don't really know what's beyond this. But the language that we use to describe what's at the very end is actually the language of mathematics. And so when you guys learn math, math is essentially a language that we use to describe some of these different rules for how the entire universe works. So then we can now look at the slide, and over on the left, we can look at these different sciences, and we can sort of put them in order, just like we put our journey in order from the outermost limits of the universe all the way down into the biology, the chemistry, the physics, and the math. So that's sort of how that these are related. But I want to show you one more example. And this is an example that my son Henry sort of thinks about. And this would be science in the Lego universe. Okay, so if you want to chime in, you can unmute your mic as we have a similar example of what science in the Lego universe would look like. Okay, so remember, in our regular universe, we started out with a couple having a picnic. So we start out with a little Lego man and Lego woman, and they're having a picnic. It looks like they're eating donuts, and maybe presents in a balloon, okay? And so what, if you guys recall now, what do we call this type of science when we study people, food, the way that they interact, the things that they eat, and so on? I'll give you a clue. It's over on the other side of the slide, highlighted for you.
Biology.
Yeah, exactly. This type of science is called biology. All right, now we're going to zoom out, okay? So when we zoom out, we take a rocket ship and we go to the outer edges of the universe. And what do we call that type of science?
Molecular biology.
Oh, no, we're going the other direction. We're going up. So in this case,
Astronomy.
astronomy. So when we study space and all of the things in space, in this case, Darth Vader and some of the, let's see, it looks like, is that a AT-AT Walker? What is that there on the left? You guys would probably know better than I would. So when we study space and all of the things in space, we call that astronomy. All right, now we're zooming back down. All right, and when we study parts of people, okay, whether it's parts of their cells, or in this case, the heads of the people, okay, we would call this what now?
Molecular biology.
Exactly. And so molecular biology is going to be parts of biological systems. So we're zooming in now. And we can even think about parts like Lego parts that would also be like this. But if we break this down even further, and we get now just into the simple pieces that would make up these Legos, this is the analogy that we would describe as chemistry. Okay, so before I go to the next slide, we'll ask you then. Now, physics, I said, is going to be the rule book for how these different parts fit together. So what do you think in our Lego universe physics might be? Any guesses?
Instruction manual.
Exactly, the instruction manual. And so here now we have is the rules about how these pieces fit together. And then finally, any guesses on how we would go even one step further into the fundamental rules for how these pieces fit?
The whole Lego set.
Whole Lego set? Well, the set, remember, is a little bit like the chemistry, right? These are just the pieces. And then we have the book that tells us how it gets put together. But there's some rules and some laws about how we describe.
Pages of the book.
Oh, pretty close. What we describe, what we would say is math in this case would be the rules for how a Lego can be versus not, like it can't be, right? So Legos are all going to fit together in a certain way, so they have to follow a certain set of rules. And so this might be then the blueprints that would describe these Lego pieces. Okay, so now you guys have a little bit of an understanding that you can study several different types of science. And as one example, I'm a scientist and I like to study science in this sort of red box space. We study biology, we study some molecular biology and biochemistry, we also study some chemistry. Well, it turns out there are other scientists who like to study astronomy, or there are some scientists who really like to study physics. So the cool thing is, being a scientist, you can study whatever you find interesting. So I find this part interesting, and other people might really find the physics interesting, or really find the astronomy interesting. Okay, now that's how we can think about these different sciences. But how about how do we study science? Well, I have good news for you. Studying science is going to happen regardless, the same way, no matter how or at what level of science you study. So if you are a biologist, or you are a physicist, or you are an astronomist, you are going to study science a lot in the same way. Okay, now, what does that look like? Well, it looks like something that we call the scientific method. So the scientific method is something that describes the process to go through to find the, to study science. Okay, so this is quite old, right? So this is an old picture of a telescope, and that was one of the really early ways that people would study science. Okay, so the scientific method is really how to be a scientist and how to carry out experiments. So the first thing, one of the most important things, is starting with a question. Okay, most science starts with a question. It starts with I'm curious about this thing. I wonder how it works. So how does that work? Or what does that do? Or what's up with that? Okay, all of these are questions that can then begin the scientific process. Okay, so after you have a question, you say, I'm curious about this thing. How does that work? Well, you need to gather a little bit of information so that you know what works and what doesn't work, or what's known and what's not known. So if you say, okay, I have a question, I want to know how something works, you figure out everything that's known, and then you find out what's not known. And then we form something called a hypothesis. Now, this is something that maybe some of you have heard of before, but this is essentially a fancy word for a guess. Okay, so we have a question, we know what's known and we know what's not known, and then that not known part, we're now going to make a guess. We say, I think that this is going to be how it works, right? Now, we test that hypothesis. So we test that guess and we figure out, was our guess close to the answer or was it way far off? Actually, it turns out when it's way far off, that's the most exciting, because if you test something and you guess it and it turns out to be right, that's not very exciting because you say to yourself, well, that's what I thought all along. But if you guess something and it's totally wrong, that's when it's exciting because you don't know the answer and now you're onto something totally new. So you test this idea, you test this guess, and that's where most of the science part comes, where you perform an experiment. So you collect some data, and then what you do is you analyze those data and you try to figure out what it means, and then finally you come up with some conclusion. So after you have all of this data, you say, okay, well, this is what I thought, this is what the data showed. Now, what does that mean? Well, we come back here and we can then form another hypothesis. I think that it means this thing. So this is a scientific method. It's quite old. It's been used for hundreds of years, but I think it needs a little refresh, okay? So this is our scientific method revised in our Lego universe. Okay, so I would say the very first step is to be curious. So I want you guys to always be looking around, always be curious, and always be wondering, well, what about that? And what's this about? And why does that do that thing? And so on. And with curiosity, then we will ask several questions. If you're not going to be curious, then you're never going to come up with any questions. So we ask a question, we gather some information about that question, we think a little bit about it, and then we take a guess. And then the fun part comes where we perform an experiment, we collect a bunch of data and analyze the results, and then we answer the question. And then the whole thing starts again. Most of the time when you answer a question, it's going to then just lead to another question. In fact, really good experiments and really good discoveries are going to ask more questions than they answer. So if you have an experiment and you have a hypothesis, you have a guess about it, and then you're going to then do the experiment and come up with the answer, it's not very interesting when the answer doesn't really lead to new questions. If the answer then leads to 10 or 50 or 100 new questions, that's when it's really exciting. So this is really how to be a scientist or how to think about science. And the good thing is, no matter what type of scientist you are, it's this process, this same process. So whether you're studying astronomy, whether you're studying biology, whether you're studying physics or math, a lot of these processes are exactly the same. You can be curious, ask a question, gather information, and so on. Now, one thing that I just want to sort of leave you with, one idea, is that when you're thinking about curiosity and we're thinking about these sort of questions, you have to explore. And then, if we're going to say, okay, well, we want to do this in the Lego universe, well, this is what explore looks like in the Lego universe. So one of the last things I want to leave you with is this idea by a famous scientist. This is Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman was a physicist, and his dad taught him something when he was really young. And I want to play this for you. It's a very short clip here.
But it was the opposite. My father had taught me, looking at a bird, he says, do you know what that bird is? It's a brown-throated thrush. But in Portuguese, it's a hontorabeiro. In Italian, a chuterapiquita. He says in Chinese, it's a tumongpong. In Japanese, a patata tokorecha, etc. He says, now you know all the languages you want to know what the name of that bird is. And when you're finished with all that, he says, you'll know absolutely nothing whatever about the bird. You only know about humans in different places and what they call the bird. Now, he says, let's look at the bird and what it's doing. He knew the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something, which I learned very, very early.
All right. So Richard Feynman is saying that his father taught him very early on the importance of asking the right type of question. So it's important to explore and be curious and ask a question, not about what's that thing called, but what does that thing do? What is that bird, where's that bird from? Why is it flying this way? What does it eat? And so on. Like asking questions that can really give you new information. And so with that, I will ask you guys to go ahead, unmute your mics, and go ahead and ask any questions that you want.
What's your favorite part of your job?
Why are all the planets in the solar system round?
Why are all the planets in the solar system round? Well, that's a good question. I don't study the planets in the solar system, but I think that gravity holds the planets together in mostly round shapes. So we would probably have to ask some people, again, with this science, there's a lot of different types of science. So we might ask an astronomer, but I think that that would probably be a good explanation.
I have a question.
Yes.
You didn't mention ecology.
Huh? Yeah, so I didn't have time to go through all of the different types of science. Ecology is really interesting. Ecology is one level higher than biology. So ecology looks at how different organisms interact in their environment. And so we can think about relationships between like a shark and a fish, and the way that the shark and the fish interact, and we call it a food chain. Scientists who study this interaction and then like what the fish eat and where they swim and the habitats of sharks and like the ocean and these things, we would call these types of scientists, this generally is called ecology. Yeah, there's a lot of different types of science that's sort of are intermediate between these levels. But that's a good question.
What's your favorite part of your job?
What's the favorite part of my job? I like teaching a lot. The two things I primarily do is I do research and I teach. And for our research, I look at my research and I look at being a scientist as a big puzzle. And so we build these maps and we build these pictures about what we know and then what we don't know. And then we try to put together the pieces of how the things that we don't know might fit together. So when I was also young, I liked doing puzzles a lot. And so I look at my work as a scientist as a puzzle. But I also like teaching. So having a chance to come and tell you guys about science, or I teach medical students and I teach them chemistry and biochemistry, or I teach graduate students, we teach them some computer science and computational biology. So these are the two favorite parts, both doing the puzzles and then teaching.
Do you still teach students?
I do. Yeah, I do. I teach a lot of different students. I don't teach students as young as you very often, but I do teach mostly students who are in college.
What's an everyday life to you?
Students.
Oh, those are two questions at the same time.
How do you teach the students?
How do I teach the students? Well, right now, actually, my teaching is a lot online, like virtual, like this. But when I teach medical students, I sort of stand up in front of a lecture, just like you have a teacher who he or she stands up in front of class and teaches you guys. So I do like that, and I sort of give information. Sometimes I also do this virtual teaching where I can stay home or I can be somewhere else, and I record lectures and make information available that way.
What's an everyday life to you?
What is in everyday life to me? Like, what do I do every day?
Yeah.
Yeah, so most of my days are reading and thinking. So I told you that one of the most important parts of being a scientist is asking the right kinds of questions. And so I have to read.
I would really like to do that because one, I love reading, and two, I sort of actually, it may not seem like it if you actually see me working, but I actually really like researching stuff. And yeah. I also do have a really creative mind. So
it sounds like you also like learning. I mean, so if you like researching things and you like reading, it's because you like learning about new things. And that's one of the things that I enjoy the most too, is when we are trying to figure out answers to some of our puzzles and our problems, that means we're just learning. So we're learning new things all the time. Okay, any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Are you one of the people who ask questions?
Do I ask questions? Yeah, actually, I help. So I work with a group of about 10 people, and 10 to 15 people, and I help ask the right questions. And so we come up with questions that we think are interesting to ask and interesting that we want to answer. So yeah, I still have to do a lot of reading and thinking and asking a lot of the right kinds of questions.
What kind of questions do you ask?
Most of the questions that my lab studies and that I'm interested are kind of in between that biology and chemistry space. And so most of my work is interested in metabolism. So metabolism is a word we use to describe all of the different types of reactions that are going on in our bodies. So when we eat food, we break down that food to make energy so we can walk and think and run and jump and live. And the way that we get from food down to that energy, we call that metabolism. So I study metabolism a lot, partially because I think it's interesting, but then also because it's important to know about metabolism, because if metabolism doesn't work, then we can get all sorts of diseases. So we can get not one kind of disease, but there's a lot of different diseases that can arise if your metabolism is broken. And so my lab generally studies metabolism in order to understand how to be healthy and how we can cure diseases.
Yeah.
Anything else?
This week we're studying ecology in class.
Oh, cool. What are you learning about in your ecology class?
Ecology.
Are you like learning, because ecology can be like about plants, it can also be about animals.
We're learning about the consequences. If you try to stop one thing, it can create other problems.
And also the water cycle.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like ecosystems, right? How everything is connected. Yep. Super cool. Well, now you guys can think about, like, you know, in the sort of thinking about these different levels of science, sort of how ecology fits into the bigger picture. That's cool.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. This was awesome.
All right.
Thanks.
Happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.